There we go. Awesome.
I consent.
Thank you.
Our guest for this Vibrant Church Conference this morning is a dear friend of mine, is the Reverend Jason Chestnut. Reverend Chestnut and I met in 2006 as we were both first-year students at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, a friendship which is now old enough to drive 16 years later. And when I first met him, the thing that stood out to me the most was how much this guy loved movies. But not just movies, everything about the story arc, the telling of the narrative, the way that the menu on DVDs was put together, the packaging, because all of that is part of the story that is being conveyed in different ways. It has been inspirational these past 16 years to watch his love of story and movies develop into a multi-pronged ministry that has reached across our nation. In his work as a writer, as a preacher, as a producer, as a filmmaker, as a documentarian, he has reached out, as his middle namesake, the great Paul, reached out across the biblical landscape, sharing the good news of Jesus Christ in many and various forms. The Reverend Jason Chestnut is the greatest or the best kept secret in the ELCA. He is a wonderful colleague in ministry, and in my life, one of the people that I feel privileged to call one of my dearest friends. With no further ado, the good Reverend Jason Chestnut.
Wow. Pastor Dan Helly with the introduction to end all introductions. Thank you, sir. I didn't even pay him to say that. So, well, it's very good to be with all of you, and especially for those of you who will be joining us later asynchronously to watch this. I'm really interested in how biblical stories shape our life, and I've been doing this storytelling for about 15 years, specifically trying to recover the discipline of telling Bible stories. So I would encourage everybody here right now just to think on your own. The first story that you remember from the Bible, the first story you remember being told, or maybe it was for a children's sermon, or maybe you learned it yourself. I'm very interested in those stories that kind of form the foundations of our faith. And since there's just a few of us, intimate group here right now, I'd like to ask you all, if you feel comfortable, to share that as a way of an introduction. I know that y'all know each other, but can you think about the first Bible story that you encountered? I'll start. And the first one I remember is Zacchaeus, and I think it's probably because it was Zacchaeus is a wee little man, and we sang that song, and it was a very it was a children's focused thing. It was at probably some VBS or something that I was at, but I remember specifically thinking, that's really cool that Jesus focused on the short guy. Although the Greek really is pretty ambiguous, right? Like, he ran up to climb a sycamore tree in order to see him because he was going by that way. That could refer to Jesus or Zacchaeus. So I also like the idea that maybe Jesus wasn't like this tall, dark, and handsome guy. Maybe he was 5'5" or 5'6" like me. So I think a lot about the Zacchaeus story, and that's kind of the first entry into the biblical narrative for me. What about y'all?
I think I was thinking that maybe for a lot of children, the first stories they hear are Genesis stories, creation, Noah, and the ark. And maybe it's because we're all gifted a children's Bible, early on, and we make it through those first chapters and then it fades away. The first story I can remember being really taken with, though, was the story of the friends who bring a man to see Jesus on a stretcher and lower him through the roof. And that image really, really stuck with me as a really cool thing for friends to do.
Yeah, thank you.
When you first asked the question, I was assuming it was something to do with Christmas. But as I really searched my memory, my first memory, Pastor Kerrigan has it dead on, has it right. My first memory really is Moses in the Nile. That story.
Yeah. Do you remember how the story made you feel, Richard?
Probably actually cared for. It would have been in a setting with a bunch of other kids at the church. There were a lot there, and some of it would have been ladies of the generation who have been the last ones passing. And I remember the storyboards we used to have that were the fabric where you could put the different people on it or whatever, the felt boards.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's what I'm remembering.
Thank you, Pastor Hilly.
The first one I actually remember being taught was the Saul to Paul story with the scales on his eyes, because we had this thing in the old, it was before Augsburg Fortress merger. It was the Augsburg Sunday School curriculum thing. And there was this pop out of Paul's head, and there were these little wheels. And if you spun the wheels, they were either eyes or scales. And I have a very vivid memory of terrorizing other children with like the scale eyes.
I'm sure that you do. Thank you. Thank you for that.
But that's really interesting, because all of these stories are based, our memories are so intimately linked with presentation, right? And the media that was used in the presentation. So
Pastor Kerrigan, are you like part of my workshop? That's exactly, that's why I asked this. I am curious on how these stories enter into our lexicon, but especially growing up, right? We, the people who shared these stories with us originally, they made sure that they shared narrative stories, right? Stories from the Bible that had an arc to it, that had drama, that had that could be easily kind of tracked. It was stories. We know. Everybody on this call knows that not everything in the Bible is so story based. And so, yeah, we pick stories that we can remember, but also we pick stories to share with kids that will be easily remembered, right? Either we're using props or we're using media to tell these stories. But what I offer to y'all today is to consider that as adults now, learning a Bible story uses the same elements, right? So there are ways that we can encounter stories that will help them be more easily remembered. And so and we do that a lot, or we can see the ways that we did that when we were children, and either the scales falling off eyes, right, or Noah and the Ark is a really popular one. The 2x2, that's a fun thing to visualize. And of course, as you know, like I'm still have a deep spot for Zacchaeus because as an adult I am 5'7" with boots on, otherwise 5'6". Random rabbit hole. Dan and I went to the same ministry and context site, and Dan is 6'7" or whatever. With blonde hair, and I'm 5'6" with dark hair, and we were always thought to be brothers, so that's kind of fun. So yeah, thank you for doing that. I'm going to share my screen during parts of this morning, and so I beg your understanding for that. We've tried it before, tried it out to make sure that you can hear as well. But can you all see that? Cool. The thing that it's doing for me is I want to make sure. Okay. So, so the world of the Bible is is steeped in this oral culture. And before we even go there, I want to remind us that we are all storytellers, and I'll come back to this point in just a second. But currently, we are in the midst of a literate culture, right? Several centuries into it. This is post the printing press, that's the best image I could find of it, of Gutenberg's printing press in Luther's time, which really did do a kind of a profound shift from oral culture into a literate culture. I agree with Phyllis Tickle, rest in peace, because right now I think we're shifting again. She talked about it as a rummage sale every 500 years or so into a new culture. And I think we're doing that right now, shifting from an oral culture, from a literate culture into this digital culture, which has only been heightened since March of 2020, but that's a different seminar topic. But the world in which the Bible was born and passed down was a world where stories were told. And oftentimes those stories were told by night, around fires. Now, the world of the Bible, and specifically of Jesus, is it's largely alien to us, but not its storytelling, not the nature of storytelling. That's not alien to us at all. I think we've all heard a story of around a fire at night, maybe because of the atmosphere, because of the person telling it, their style, her flourishes, his theatrical enunciation. Or maybe we've told a story to our spouse or significant other after a long day. The structure and pleading of a powerful story that we experience, but we don't practice that story beforehand. It's just by nature of us being an extremely social storytelling species. We tell stories all the time. So I'm offering that up to you all now that you are storytellers, whether or not you even identify or understand yourself in that way. You are a storyteller. I want to come back from the sharing for a second and share with y'all a story from Mark's Gospel. I'm going to tell it in two different ways. I want you to see what you notice. It's going to be the same story from Mark's 10th chapter. They came to Jericho. And as he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up. He is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately, he regained his sight and followed him on the way. I want you to consider sort of what you experienced there as far as reading the story. Before I ask questions, I'm going to tell it to you the second time. So I want you to hold both kind of in tension. Now they came to Jericho. And as Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him, "Shh," to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stood still. And he said, call him here. And yeah, they called to the blind man saying, get up, take heart. He's calling you. And throwing off his cloak, anapadesas, he sprang up. He resurrected. Elthan prostan Yesun, and he came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, what do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said to him, Rabbi, my teacher, let me see again. And Jesus said, go. Your faith has made you well. And immediately he regained his sight. And he followed Jesus on the way. So I want to ask what you noticed from either of those readings, or maybe from seeing both readings together. And I'm asking this question on a very base level. So imagine I'm asking this question to a group full of college students, which I've done. Like, even if it seems very, very simple or obvious, what did you notice?
One thing I noticed was the first time, because your tonality of reading, and it sounded more like a Sunday morning gospel where you're taking those breaths to look up from the text, and that gave me time to think about like the things that I know about the text, if that makes sense. Whereas the second time, due to the interaction and the presentation, I was a lot more engaged because I wanted to see what you were doing with the text, which put me in that text in a different way, because I'm like, what's he going to do? Which that cued me in to notice a lot of those like semantic choices you made and things like that. Because I wanted to know what you were doing, not me patting myself on the back for like, oh yeah, this happens in Jericho.
Right. So, a big piece of this is that in the second time around, which y'all, I mean, you understand this. The first time I'm reading it from the Bible, the second time I'm storytelling it, right? But I'm making choices when I do that.
Right.
Also, as Dan mentioned, like as much as maybe you noticed, right, that I knew that story pretty well, and yet I still had to look in the Bible, right? I had the script in front of me, so I couldn't necessarily engage with y'all in the same way. I had to get the words right. Thank you for that. What else?
So my homiletics professor, and I'm, despite my age, I just was in seminary several years ago. And I might get her name wrong, but it's Shauna Hannon at PLTS, talked about how if you do a reading like you did the second time, it really reflects your theology and what your emphasis is going to be. And it's part of the preaching itself, as opposed to the first is more neutral. But the second is so much more engaging. So much more engaging. And so let me ask, you were looking at the text from the Bible as you were doing that?
Not the second time, no.
Not the second time, okay. Because I know a person, was a pastor named Doug Pretorius, who sort of introduced me to all this, 20 years ago. And my fear is always sort of that I'm going to use a wrong word. If I do it by memory, I would use a wrong word or leave out an element of the story or something, and somehow ending up doing something theologically damaging to the story.
Yeah, that's fair, Richard. Thank you. And we're going to get into sort of the how of this. I wanted to show you this specifically to say that even if I read it well, which I did the first time, I think we have all been in worship services from the gospel when the gospel is read. That reminds me of when I tell stories. Sometimes I'll get a feedback from people saying, "You made the story come alive." And I don't say this in the moment because it would probably sound like a jerk. But one of the founding storytellers of the network of biblical storytellers, which is a group I'm a part of, his name is Dennis Dewey, and he says, as Christians, we already believe in a living word. So our job is not to kill it. And
Yeah.
we all know what it sounds like when somebody kills the word, right? It's kind of maybe what we normally are expecting to experience on Sunday mornings. No shade to any pastor who might read the gospel. But especially if there's just a sense of, I've had many, I've seen it myself, right? Where people haven't spent any time in the word in the story itself. And so when they read it, it's pretty atrocious. And it might make me, as I've seen people in churches do, kind of like my mind might go to the grocery lists I need to get after worship or something like that, right? So it's really our job as storytellers is to recognize that the story, the Bartimaeus story, is already alive. It's been told numerous times over the generations, and it's changed people's lives. I think more than just Bartimaeus, it's changed many people's lives, and yet our job is simple as storytellers, which is to not kill that thing. Now, with that in mind, we recognize, as Pastor Hilly mentioned, when we tell the story, we're making choices. And so Pastor Richard as well named this, right, that perhaps when we make those choices, we kind of run risks of being theologically. I mean, we have to focus on certain things. And so I read those two stories to show a couple different things, that even if I know the story well, the minute that I'm able to not lean on the script of the scripture, the minute I'm able to take it in myself, then it does change things. It offers a different kind of story, and a very different story. If I had Dan tell the story as well right after me, if he had learned it by heart and told it right after me, it would be a very different story than the story I told, right? So that's just a recognition, I think, of like what storytelling can do. I also want to come back to your question, Richard. You brought up a couple of good points that I'll come back to later. I'm going to come back to sharing my screen here because I want to dig into kind of the how of what we're doing. So even as we are beyond our oral culture, or we've like kind of lived through our oral culture, we have still maintained and held on to the stories. And so these stories that we're learning now are a way to connect us back to that ancient initial world, the world of early Christianity that was incredibly oral and that learned in that way. Now, we heard it a little bit already, but I hear it all the time, right? That anytime I do any kind of storytelling workshop, I can hear it even if it's not said out loud. I can hear people looking at me with the words, dude, I can't memorize. Are you kidding me? There's no way. There's no way I could do that. So I want to offer up two different rebuttals to that, I guess I should say. So the first rebuttal, well, I want to tell you a quick story that I didn't prep you in at all, but it's a story about these three pigs, right? That got into an idea of they wanted to finally own a house. They were tired of renting, leasing their housing, which I can definitely relate to. And so maybe you've heard this before. Maybe this is sounding a little familiar to you, but a big bad wolf came down to knock these buildings down, right? And so the pigs then, when they built these, the wolf came and the wolf came to them, right? And he said, little pig, let me come in. And what did the pigs say back to him?
Hair of my chinny chin chin.
Yeah, how did you know that? Not by the hair of my chinny chin chin. I didn't prep you for that at all, did I? Right? But you knew that. And the wolf actually came back. Do you know what the wolf said in response to that? Then I'll huff
And I'll puff.
and I'll puff
And I'll blow your house
and I'll blow your house in, right? Like, so,
Yeah.
okay. So real quick, every time I share my screen, I can't see you, sadly. How did y'all know that? I didn't prep you for that, right? You knew that beforehand walking in, right? You knew that story already. And of course, yes, you did, because that story is a part of you. It's down deep. I didn't have to prep you at all. That story is there. Sorry for this, and of course this animation is off. My apologies. But you knew that story already. And you probably knew that story for a couple different reasons. One of them, I think that it's helpful for us to remember, is that it rhymes, right? Little pig, let me come in, not by the hair of my chinny chin chin. It's almost kind of a sing-songiness to it, but you have that deep down. You have that inside yourself. I didn't have to prep you for that story at all. You have memorized that story, but I would say even more than memorization, you know that story by heart. Memorizing in biblical storytelling, in the biblical storytelling world, we kind of look at that as a 4-letter swear word, because we're not asking you to memorize at all. What biblical storytelling is doing is asking you to learn something by heart, so deep down that you know it already. I'm sure many of you, if you get in your car after this workshop and you're driving around listening to music, some of that music might be really old, and yet you might know it by heart, every lyric. That's not going anywhere. It's not something that you memorize like the periodic table when I was in 8th grade that I learned just using my brain, and then it all kind of went away. When it comes to stories like this, you know them deep, deep down. Now,
it's sorry to interrupt, but there were several prophets who talked about it. It'll be inscribed in our hearts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Inscribed in our hearts is a great way to look at it. And please interrupt at any point, especially when I'm sharing my screen, because for some reason, maybe because I'm not the host, I can't see your faces. So yes, please interrupt at any point. But my point of this is, right, you didn't memorize this story about the 3 little pigs before you came here. You know it by heart. It's inscribed in you in some ways. And we see how that is, right? It's also it's a narrative. There's this apex moment, this dramatic moment when the wolf gets in front, gets in the face of the pig, and there's this back and forth. And so it's a narrative story, like the stories we remember as children. And so that's one piece of it. Another piece of what we're doing when we're learning this story is that we are taking this story off of the page, right? So if we were in person right now, I'd have you pull out your ELW number 661 and look at this song. I love to tell the story. Now, what we're doing and what we'll do together this morning, I'm gonna do less of running, actually doing some of these things, and more. I'm showing you different ways to encounter Bible storytelling, different ways to recognize what we're doing here. And so this first time, I want you to imagine you've got that ELW out in front of you. Let's read the first verse the way that we often encounter the Bible, which is silently to ourselves. So go ahead and read this first text here. All right, now the second verse, I'm going to read it out loud. I'll read it out loud. I love to tell the story, how pleasant to repeat. What seems each time I tell it more wonderfully sweet. I love to tell the story, for some have never heard the message of salvation from God's own holy word. Now, maybe you can see a little echoes here of the big bad wolf and the 3 little piggies. in just the normal ways that humans have figured out how to remember things. We have this rhyming happening, right?
Mhm.
Repeat, sweet, heard, word. Maybe you're even hearing the general, and I'm sure that you have, that even when you're reading it silently, like the first verse, you're hearing this sung, right? You've heard this sung before. Maybe you've sung it yourself many times. And so there's that track going on in the background. And that the way that I kind of read this, I'm not necessarily I'm not looking at that first comma there in the second line, what seems, comma, each time I tell it. I'm not reading it in that way because I can kind of hear it. I can hear the rhythm. Now, this third time, we're in person. I would ask us all to sing it. Now, singing it on YouTube, excuse me, singing it through Zoom is a whole other thing. But I'm almost positive that y'all can hear this in your heads, right? And I'm just going to do a quick little piece of it to just hear that difference, right? That the minute that we sing it, I love to tell the story for those who know it best. That third one, right? That's the key. That's what this song was meant for, right? So like when we first read it silently, we were engaging maybe just that brain, that certain part of our brain, we were hearing it in our heads. The second time when we read it out loud, we're engaging, our mouth as well, our voice as well as our head, our brain. But the third time, this is what this song was meant for, right? And if you're reading it along in the ELW or a hymnal, I think it becomes even more powerfully apparent that this song was meant to be sung. The Bible stories that we have in our Bible, they are meant to be told. But we have spent most of the time in our literate culture, especially, reading a lot of that Bible alone, silently, which is not a bad way to do it. It's just not what it was meant for. It's sort of like, and I'm going to reference my advisor at LSTC for a time and the professor David Rhodes, who is sort of a giant in this field. And he said that reading the Bible silently is sort of like composers looking at Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the sheet music, but never hearing it played. So there are things we can do with our mind, with the way that we encounter the story, but if we don't hear it being told, then I think that we're missing something, right?
Yes.
These stories are meant to be told, just like every hymn is meant to be sung. If we got together and we got to the hymn of the day after Pastor Hilly had given us a powerful message that's still reverberating in our ears, and we just said, I love to tell the story, 'twill be my theme and glory, to tell the old story of Jesus and his love. Right? That it's missing something. And so when we engage and encounter this, what biblical storytelling really is doing is trying to recover this Bible, these stories in the Bible as stories worth telling. I want to shift to a handout that I sent ahead of time, and I'm not sure if y'all had a chance to look at it or even print it out, but I wanted to also show you visually. This would be your handout if we were gathering in person. I want you to just take a look at the story there on the left first, on Mark's story. And again, imagining that there's no answer that's too simple. What do you notice about the story there on the left? Let me come back from sharing real quick. Oh, Am I not sharing anymore? My God.
You're
Sorry,
not
y'all.
sharing. So try sharing. Yeah.
You think I've used Zoom before. Okay. So let me show you what I looked at when I read that story. Y'all know what I'm doing here, but like, that's what I looked at, right?
Right.
This is where we encounter most of our Bible stories. Incredibly small print, justified, whatever, like center justified or whatever, right? It's all packed together. You can see that I've got a little red letter Bible here, a little throwback. Right. It's really hard to read from this. It's sort of like our Bibles were meant to be read silently alone because they're really hard to read out loud. Okay. So recognizing this, let's go back real quick. Right. So what do you notice? What do you notice here? The same story. Where are the verse numbers?
Right.
Right? Not only that,
broken up into like breaths or phrases or thoughts.
right.
Mhm.
Right? So that it's letting it breathe a little bit. Literally on the page, letting it breathe. Right?
Yes.
But also, like, again, no verse numbers. And perhaps you've seen this before, or I mean, y'all, I know my audience and who I'm talking to. But that second handout is to give people a sense of, what it would look like to encounter these stories before they were ever written down, or initially when they were written down, right? Forget punctuation, forget capital letters, forget verse numbers, right? On the right there is Mark chapter 1. So you can see maybe at the very beginning, right? The beginning of the good news of Jesus, the anointed, the Son of God, as written in the prophet Isaiah. See, I can read that a little bit just because I know that story ahead of time. But imagine carrying this handout, this Mark 1. Imagine reading from that if you didn't know the story already.
Yeah.
So we've kind of gotten a little lazy in looking at our Bible in a way that isn't primed for telling it. So we have to get it out of that page. We have to get it onto another page. Forget the verse. Nobody cares about the verse numbers, right? I mean, I know I put it up there at the top just so that people know I didn't just come up with this out of nowhere. But right, so we get it out. We also recognize that there's, as Dan said, there's different beats here. I say there's different scenes that are happening. And every story, I think, has a scene, has these scenes happening. And so if we can imagine this story, as a filmmaker myself, I'm imagining how I would shoot this story, how I would film it, where we would start. But on a very basic level, before we get into any of the how, I just want you all to take a look at what it means to get that story out of the Bible. That's what we're looking for. We're looking to get these stories out of the Bible. I love the Bible, and this actual, flesh and blood Bible that I'm holding up right now, the red letter Bible. This is something that too often our sisters and brothers in the faith can use this to literally thump somebody else on the back of the head, right? We've used these Bibles in violent ways. And I think it's important to remember that for the first 2 or 3 centuries of the Jesus movement, we never had anything like this. And if we had a Bible, very few people could have read it, right? And so I wanted us to just take a second with this. Also, just a little small piece of like, again, like this is in our language, y'all. This is the language that all of us speak.
Yeah.
And look how difficult it is to even understand what's going on here. I also think it's very appropriate to Mark, who can never use immediately enough. This feels very immediate to me, right? So again, this handout, I just wanted you all to, we'll come back to this again. But just take a second with that story and look at how I would say how much easier it is to grab onto the story, to make sense of it when it's outside the Bible and it's just written down in a way that's like, oh, okay, this makes this. There's these three different movements, right? The people coming to Jericho and leaving it. There's Bartimaeus encountering, hearing that it's Jesus of Nazareth and kind of, inserting himself into the story. And then, of course, the third act where Jesus and Bartimaeus interact with one another. That makes it kind of, it gives us a sense of, just as when we sing I Love to Tell the Story, we know there are 3 verses. We know what's coming next. It gives us a way to envision this story. And again, right, to learn these stories by heart means that in some ways we're encountering the Bible the way that the early Christians did. As I said, that even if we had a Bible and we could hold it up, let's say we had a Bible in those first couple of centuries, we wouldn't be able to read it even if we had one, right? So for the people who were encountering this story, the first Christians to do it, they couldn't read, and the storyteller herself couldn't read. And so we had to learn these stories by heart, which we know we can do in the same way that we can maybe sing I Love to Tell the Story by heart after hearing it enough times. We can tell these stories by heart as well. I'm going to just spend a little bit more time on the why before we get to the how. So the why of biblical storytelling, not that I have to convince y'all, but I think it's always just important to know that we're telling these stories not just because we're bored or we're looking for a new way to encounter the Bible. We're telling these stories and learning to tell Bible stories in some ways to recover what the early Christians, our ancestors in the faith, how they encounter the Bible. And I think that's important to do. One way to recognize this is to go back to Mark 1, which we saw on that handout. That encountering the Bible the way the early Christians did is to remember and recognize that there are so many echoes in the Bible itself. And I want to show that and to recognize, I want to take a second to go first to one of the most powerful storytellers we have in our current age, in this literate, moving to digital age. And that is Hollywood. Hollywood's an extremely, even regardless of how you feel about Hollywood, they are a very diligent storyteller. And the stories that we have from the Bible show us, can remind us of these echoes as well. So if you've seen Tarantino's Pulp Fiction and maybe you saw that there are a lot of things that Tarantino especially does that is giving these callbacks to earlier movies, to earlier stories, so that there's a connection there for the audience that gets it. We have this a lot in our stories. We see a lot of echoes happening, that the people who tell stories today are influenced and in some ways are marinating in stories from the past, stories that they grew up with. A very specific one that I put together is the opening 2 or 3 minutes of 2 movies that couldn't be more different. Scorsese's take on the novel by Nikos Kazantzakis, The Last Temptation of Christ, and a cult classic that never really got its due in the theater, but now has become extremely popular, Donnie Darko. And I'm showing this to you in like a little GIF format. But if you watch the two together, it's kind of incredible to see how similar the openings are. And just to make sure, Sam Raimi, who directed Donnie Darko, just in case we didn't miss anything, he makes sure that the protagonist later on in the movie goes and sees a double feature that includes, right? That last temptation of Christ. I show you these just to say that there are these echoes that we can see in storytelling, and those echoes are also present in our Bible stories, specifically in the first chapter of Mark, that if we can put ourselves in the position of Jesus's listeners and of the audience of the early Gospels, of Mark especially, we might forget that they're not just hearing the story itself, they're hearing all these echoes of stories from before. I want us to just see a little piece of this done from a collection of storytellers who are also biblical scholars that give us a sense of what maybe Mark chapter 1 may have sounded like to the original hearers.
The beginning of the good news.
How beautiful! Upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who proclaims peace, who brings good news, who proclaims salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns.
The beginning of the good news of Jesus, the Anointed One.
The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.
Of Jesus, the Anointed One.
Samuel took a phial of oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him. He said, the Lord has anointed you ruler over his people Israel, and you shall reign over the people of the Lord, and you will save them from the hand of their enemies all around.
The good news of Jesus, the Anointed One.
I'm not going to go through that whole thing, but maybe again you could see a little bit of these echoes that are happening. And I think that's important to remember, specifically in the ways in which the biblical storytelling can take us back to this moment, to remind us of maybe how early Christians encountered the Bible. That's a little bit of the why. I think it draws us back to our early ancestors in the faith. And so that's kind of that's a piece of why it's so important to learn Bible stories. I want to spend a little bit of time in doing a little bit of the how. Now, the how in the Bible stories, I'm going to show y'all, offer up several different ways that you could learn a story like this. And I want you to just kind of take it, maybe with a few grains of salt, and recognize like how I'm giving you a lot of different options for how to encounter a Bible story. Especially if you're going to learn one, there are many different ways that you can learn. I'm wondering, before we get to the first one, do y'all have that handout with you? It's okay if you don't. Do you have it printed out, or that you could look at it on the screen somewhere? Oh, look at you, Katie. Yeah, rock on. I want to do this just because for the time that we have, we can't run through each way that you could learn, but we can do we can show a few of them, and we can show kind of how they can help. But all of this comes down to beyond memorizing. So I want you to think of memorizing as just using your brain space, using your head. A lot of us have stories that maybe we can tell of times that we tried to memorize something and it was awful and we barely kept it in our head for the time that we had it. And what these different ways of encountering the Bible will do for us this morning is give different ways to learn a story and to use more than just our head, to use all of us, specifically to recognize that word remember. So if memorizing is a bad word, I think remember is a powerful word, because the word itself, right, is to put back the members of something, to remember something. And if we can learn these stories beyond just our head, if we learn them in our bodies, maybe you could, as Dan said, from those two readings of Bartimaeus, that second reading, when I told the story, not only was I making choices, but maybe you could see as well that I was using my body in ways that made sense to me. Watching that Mark chapter 1, you saw a couple different kinds of tellings. Phil Riggy Jones, as you could see, like he uses some pretty big gestures. It's all about what is most comfortable for you. And I would go back to a reminder that we are all storytellers. And so if you come home from a long day and you tell your partner what happened to you that day, even as you haven't practiced it before, you tell that story, you use the kinds of nonverbals that make sense to you, right, to tell that story. And so in the same way, we're going to ask that we bring in all the troops when we're learning a story. We bring in every part of ourselves, because that's going to help us learn it later. In the same way that oftentimes we'll remember lyrics of a song because we've danced along with it, right? The minute that we bring our bodies into this and embody this story, the easier it is to learn it. So, with that in mind, I want us to go back. The first way to learn this story, I think, is one of the most powerful ways, is called Provoking the Text. I'm going to go back here real quick just to... This is from a professor at Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Richard Swanson, who has done, actually, he's done a whole series of provoking the Gospels. So each of the 4 Gospels, he has a book out there about provoking it. And the idea behind provoking a text is to remember and to trust that God's word can take it. And in the same way of like the decisions I made when I told Bartimaeus that second time, it's a reminder that this text is not one-dimensional, that the script of Scripture that we have in our Bibles is a starting point. And so often, maybe we're not killing the text, but if we read it in worship and we kind of read it at a flat tone, maybe like I would read a letter from my internet provider or something, like when we encounter it that way, then it's going to come out that way. When we encounter it as something sort of, I don't know, I won't say boring, but when we encounter it in a way that it's kind of flat words on the page, then we lose some things. And so what Professor Swanson is offering is a way to provoke the text. And the way that we do this is called a read around, where we each take one line from the story in the way that I have separated it out. And each time we are provoking it in a different way. So we're reading it out loud to get it out off the page, right? But we're also throwing out different ways to read it to see if there's something that we can mine from this, some wisdom that we could perhaps mine from this. And so with that read around, I want to go back in case you don't have that in front of you. I want us to go back to the handout that I sent. And so you see each of those lines, right? So one line is they came to Jericho. Another line is as Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd. And then a third line, we're leaving Jericho. So each of those lines, we're going to separate that out and take it one at a time. And so I'm gonna ask y'all, and again, I will start, and we're gonna read it out loud together. And let me stop the share for a second. Of course, I can't see my mouse. There we go. So I'll start. I'm gonna offer or invite y'all to unmute and we'll go in order. And so the way that I can see it from my boxes here, it'll be me and then Katie and then Pastor Hilly and then Richard, right? And we'll keep going around. So I'll read that first line. We'll keep going down. And then when you're done with your line, then it comes back to me and I'll keep going. We'll keep reading until we're done with that story. Does that make sense?
I don't have a copy of the printout, so just the three of you.
Okay. So Richard, I'm going to throw this on the screen so that you could, would that work?
Okay, I'll try. I'm on my phone, so okay.
Oh, you're on your phone. Okay. Well, I won't push you. You can just hear it. You'll hear it out loud. Dan, do you have a copy with you? Okay.
Yep.
All right. So the first time we're just going to read it normally, we're going to get it off the page and kind of read it out loud.
Clarification.
Yes.
Each line is just as you have it on a typeset line. Is that what you're talking about? Sort of.
Right. So
Rather than a whole sentence.
Exactly. So It's the
Awesome.
lines that we've created ourselves on this
Awesome.
handout.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So let's start. They came to Jericho.
As Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd
We're leaving Jericho.
Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar,
was sitting by the roadside.
When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth,
he began to shout and say,
Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me.
many sternly ordered him to be quiet.
but he cried out even more loudly,
Son of David, have mercy on me.
Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here."
and they called the blind man, saying to him,
Take heart. Get up. He's calling you.
So, throwing off his cloak,
he sprang up and came to Jesus.
Then Jesus said to him,
"What do you want me to do for you?"
And the blind man said to him,
Rabboni, my teacher, let me see again.
Jesus said to him,
Go, your faith has made you well.
Immediately, he gained his sight and followed him on the way.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, the provoking piece of this, we're just going to do one example to show you what this could look like. We're going to tell it like it's a very important secret, and a secret that maybe we would get in trouble if somebody heard us talking about it. So every line, I want you to pretend like it's a secret. This might not work for every aspect of the story, but the idea of provoking the gospel is to shake it up a little bit, to know that God's word can handle this, and to say, what are we missing? Or what is something that maybe can come from this that we're not seeing on the surface? So we're going to tell it one more time, and this time I'm going to have Dan start us. So Dan, you're going to start us with They Came to Jericho. It'll go to me, and then we'll continue to do the roundabout way. But I want us to read every line, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense in the story. I want you to tell every line like it's a very precarious secret. Okay?
They came to Jericho.
As Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd.
We're leaving Jericho.
Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar,
was sitting by the roadside.
When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth,
he began to shout out and say,
Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me.
many sternly ordered him to be quiet.
but he cried out even more loudly,
Son of David, have mercy on me.
Jesus stood still and said, Call him here.
And they called the blind man, saying to him,
Take heart, get up. He's calling you.
So, throwing off his cloak,
he sprang up and came to Jesus.
And then Jesus said to him,
What do you want me to do for you?
The blind man said to him,
Rabboni, my teacher, let me see again.
Jesus said to him,
"Go, your faith has made you well."
Immediately, he gained his sight and followed Jesus on the way. Now,
That was worth the 2 hours.
yeah, tell me more.
Just wow. Like I said, this professor that I had for homiletics talked about the preaching being the work of the entire congregation, not just the pastor, and had all sorts of exercises that you could engage people. Don't ask, or not don't ask, don't tell. And I noticed I wonder and a whole bunch of different things, but that would be a really good exercise to do with a congregation just around a table at dinner church or wherever. Yeah.
Yes, amen, Richard. Thank you. Exactly. And there are so many different things like. The minute that you invite them to provoke once, you can provoke so many different times.
Yeah.
I want to tell one story of like why this provocation has been so powerful to me. Is that the minute I learned it, I did it with the passion narrative from Mark, just myself, trying to figure out what was going on here. And I told a piece of it out loud as though it were a joke. Now think about it, like 95% of it wasn't going to land, right? Telling the passion narrative as a joke, like no way. But I'll tell you one thing it did. One moment that it hit for me was when it said, and they crucified him there. And the inscription of the charge against him read, "This is the King of the Jews," right? So that even the sign was mocking him. I never could have gotten that unless I provoked that and said, what if this whole thing is a joke, right? I think there's something theologically really powerful to have the whole thing be a secret, especially in Mark with Jesus and his messianic secret. What does it look like to tell these stories as though maybe they weren't supposed to be told out loud, that the stories are being told the way Jesus told them? Don't tell anybody about this, right? Don't tell anybody about who I am. What does that story look like then? And so that to me kind of, it opens up the possibilities, right?
Could you send us later like a list of the different ways that we can provoke?
Sure. Yeah.
I can take 4 or 5 of them, but yeah.
Yeah. I will. And there are ones that are just, I mean, sometimes I have people read it as fast as possible just to get through their line as fast as possible, get through their line as slow as possible. And again, imagine that we had like 12 of us in your Sunday school class before worship in a circle. They will remember this story more than any other story they've encountered. They might get a little, especially go 3, 4, 5 times. They might be like, okay, how many times are we going to read through this story? But it's really powerful, especially when we recognize that, again, if Dan and I had learned this story together and told it back to back, we would tell two very different stories. And so consider that. The provoking for me is one of the more powerful resources or ways to learn the Bible or learn these stories. I want to offer up several more real quick, but any other things just on the provoking that or this exercise that jump out at you?
But we're always preaching in a context. So by doing this and hearing your different people and how the spins that they put on this are going to help you learn your context.
Yeah.
And be able to tell the moods of the people you're with, and who's in a good mood, who's really sad about something, or great idea.
Yeah. And if you have, I've done it with like younger children who have come to this. Many times they have never read the Bible out loud. They've never been given Jesus's words to read, right? Yeah. If it comes to them and they have Jesus's words in their mouth, that can be really powerful.
We have this whole thing that most congregations want every one of the texts written down in the bulletin or an insert or something or other, and then they're glued to it while you're trying to talk or tell the story.
Yeah, exactly. And that can also get in the way of if you're telling it. You had said earlier, Richard, when I told that you're not sure if you could like learn every single word. It's tricky, and especially you can see in this in the handout that some lines, and he said to them, and they said to him, and he said, and that's why for the network of biblical storytellers, we throw out two numbers. We try to tell these stories with 75% word accuracy, which gives us some wiggle room.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't a midrash, so I'm not, saying it from Bartimaeus's viewpoint. Although I'll tell you, the more time I spend with this, the more time I'd like some fanfic to be written from Bartimaeus after this, especially because he specifically disobeys Jesus. Jesus says, "Go on your way," and he follows him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In some ways, Bartimaeus is saying, "My way is your way." And Mark is telling us that that's the way, right? Because this is 10. It's right before the Palm Sunday reading. And it's also giving us that, like, I capitalized way, right? Because of the early Christians calling themselves followers of the way. So there's a lot happening in this story that kind of prefigures that, right? I was going to say something else. Oh, go ahead, please.
So I was a literature major who practiced law then for 30 years. And so there's so much of the Bible that when you said, he said it, he said it, he said it, he said, there's so many pronouns that sometimes I will actually, when you have one of those back and forth, try to do the thing where you're on this side and then you shift to that side when, the different people telling the story back and forth to each other.
Yeah, that's a good theater training, Richard, right? And block out and kind of give us different, and you don't have to do too much of it. I think also storytelling we're not dramatizing the gospel, no matter how many times people have told me that I've done that. Mm-hmm. I want you to think about it more as though you're telling a story that you were there and you're telling it to somebody else. So Dan, you will not believe, but as Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, there was a blind man there called Bartimaeus, right? I'm telling the story as though I were there, and less so of a back and forth, although it really is important to kind of name that. I want to say the other thing about the storytelling, the network of biblical storytelling. So we give ourselves 75% word accuracy, but then the more intense one, we say that we have to be 95% content accurate. And by that, I mean, I could miss some words or get some pronouns wrong or on the Bartimaeus story, but I don't lose the core of that. I don't lose the crowd saying, "Get up, take heart, he's calling you." I don't lose the back and forth between Jesus and Bartimaeus. I don't lose the two times that Bartimaeus cries out and calls Jesus something that nobody else in the Gospels call him, right? Son of David. He's never called that except for Bartimaeus. So those pieces, and also just looking at the context of the story itself, right? So just recognizing what's going on here at this moment, recognizing how marginalized Bartimaeus is, not just as a beggar, but a blind beggar. He's literally on the side of the road, all those things, right? The things that you would do as you prepare your sermons. And so that's why I would say a story well told is sort of a sermon half preached.
Oh, yeah.
If you can tell that story well, you're halfway to your sermon. Especially because oftentimes in our liturgy, we marginalize the story by having it. And I know this is a larger thing. I'm not looking to switch around our liturgy, but I will say it's interesting to imagine that what if our gospel or the text itself came after our sermon, so that we're prepping our people to encounter this story. The way that we do it now can be good. And to quote David Rhodes again, when we read a scripture and often read it kind of as a boring text and then give a really good sermon on it, what we're doing is we're telling a joke and then we're explaining why the joke is funny. And I think a more powerful thing would just be to tell the joke well, right? And so in some ways, and that's kind of that's why this, as a spiritual discipline, this has made me kind of reconsider how I look at my sermon, especially if I'm learning the story beforehand. Is I'm thinking more and more of, well, how do I get people to really engage with this story more than just, okay, here's where Pastor Richard reads the gospel. We can take a little moment before we get to the real point, which is the sermon, right? Mm-hmm. Theologically, I don't think that holds much water, because these are the stories that give us life, right? And so how do we engage with them? Please.
Probably one out of 3 weeks, I talk for a minute or two before I read the gospel.
Yeah, exactly.
And sometimes I'll use NSRV, but then end up sort of retelling chunks of it out of Message or something or other during the sermon. Yeah,
absolutely. And I'm also just for what it's worth, I've also been really engaged with the Common English Bible, which is free online. It's not the Common English version, right? This is a new one, but the Common English Bible. Which, two things about it. One is it has a majority women scholars for the first time ever of any translation. And it also is a throwback, because the Common English Bible is the first one since the King James Version to ask, as one of the qualifications for a translation, how does it sound out loud? So again, recognizing, and the more time you spend with the NRSV, the more this is true. The NRSV never asked, what does it sound like out loud? Clearly, it never asked that question. Now, translation-wise, I think it's powerful. I still look at the NRSV all the time. But the Common English Bible, and I think in some ways maybe that's what Peterson was doing with the Message, was how does it sound out loud as a story, right? Not just are all of these words translated correctly, but what does it sound like out loud when we get it off the page?
I've been playing around with using a version that I bought from Fresh Expressions US that's called Jesus Stories. That's a small volume just with the 4 Gospels and Acts. And I think it's based largely on CEV, but a few changes. And they strip out all of the numbering and everything. And yeah, it's good to just sort of tell a story. I'm using that in a dinner church right now.
Right. And I think what you're getting close, or what you're hitting on, Richard, is a larger piece of, in my opinion, these stories are already super powerful. That's why we still have them. After thousands of years, we're still reading these same stories. Mm-hmm. And so how can we share that with our people? That these are powerful stories, not just something we read out loud because it's part of our liturgy, right?
Right.
But it's something that clearly gave life to generations of people.
Yeah.
And continues to give life to us today. I find that pretty stunning. Mm-hmm. I want to spend just a little bit of time, thank you for this, a little bit of time just running through the other ways you can learn a story if you're interested in going farther with this. The provoking the gospel is good to get it out and to kind of play around with it. And also there are other ways to get this story as close as possible, kind of to learn it by heart. So a couple of the other ways to do this. So we've already done the read around. Oh yeah, let me show you, Richard. Let's see. What do I have people do? I do that, and then I have people do that, which is what we did. Mm-hmm. And then I have people, like I had talked about, with the passion narrative from Mark, right? That's what I had them do. But there are so many. Mm-hmm. I once I had it read it like you're really annoyed. Read it like you don't understand what this is or why you're reading it.
The late junior high version.
I'm telling you. And when you do this with kids or with teenagers, it really kind of opens them up to like let go of some of their hesitations around the Bible, because man, I feel like kids are almost the most hesitant to throw around the Bible, right? Mm-hmm. When it's like, y'all, like this is what it's made for, you know? Okay, so that's the read around. Here's some other ones, which again, if we were in person, we'd spend some more time with. But the second one, I call it the movie option, which is in that handout, you'll see there's a lot of space on the left. I indent a lot to the right, so there's space on the left, so that you could, if you have that paper out, and perhaps you can. I'm gonna show you my old one here. You can see how much I've used it. But like when you move it over here, then what you can do is you can fold your piece of paper this way. And what I ask people to do is for each of those 1, 2, 3, each of those scenes, I want you to write out a trailer, a movie tagline for what happens. Could be a word, could be a phrase, could be a whole sentence. It just needs to be evocative and something that makes you think of what's happening there. And the example that I give is a movie called The Social Network. This is a really awful pixelated version of this. But The Social Network was a movie by about 10 years ago now, about the start of Facebook, which is wild. But their tagline was perfect. You don't get to 500 million friends, which now, what is it? You don't get to 2 billion friends without making a few enemies. So for the entire movie, that's your tagline. It's brilliant. So what I offer people to do is to write a teaser themselves for each of those 3 acts, right? Write something out, and I'll just give you the ones I've used before. So for this first scene of they came to Jericho, which is, it's an interesting part of this story, right? They came to Jericho and then they left it. That's the first part of this story. They came to Jericho and then they leave. But my first like piece there, I say, watch out. The second scene, I say reversal of fortunes. And then the third scene, I say on the way. Those are ones that I had just done before or that I had thought of. I want to just take a few minutes right now. If you were considering a tagline for any of these, for the first kind of the first scene, which is not that much, or the second scene, the third scene, take a few minutes right now and imagine a teaser, a trailer, a movie tagline that you would do for one of those scenes. And while you're doing this, just to say that what this is hopefully engaging with people is for them to visualize this story. So more than just, saying it out loud or memorizing it, trying to get all the words right. We're inviting people to imagine, what does Jericho look like right now? What does it feel like as the group of Jesus and his followers, and now a large crowd is following him? What does that look like? Where's Bartimaeus in this, right? Is there a lot of dust being kicked up? What does it look like? What does it smell like? What does it sound like? That's what this is trying to get people to engage when it comes to the story. Would anybody like to share one of their teasers?
Sure. For that first section, I would almost I would say the road from ruin, because not only does it set up what we're about to hear from the healing perspective, but also it echoes that the last time we saw Jericho was when the walls came tumbling down.
Okay.
So it points back to that echo from the Old Testament and is touching base on what we're about to see.
I love it. Yes, exactly. The road from ruin. That's good. One more.
I've noticed a progression from through the scenes that is kind of I'm fixating on. So Bartimaeus is unnoticed or practically hidden in the first. In the second,
Mm,
he's getting noticed, or how to get noticed, or something like that.
right.
And 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 then in the third, I've been so fixated on that first line in the third scene. So throwing off his cloak, which is like throwing off his invisibility cloak. I mean, I've just been really
I love
playing
that.
with that in my head for a while. But it goes from being unseen to seeing. So there's like a movement there. So I keep thinking of, I'm playing with taglines that would
I
kind
love
of
that. Thank you so much for that, Katie. Especially just, I love that I don't think I've had anybody do that before, of like looking at it more from like 30,000 feet up, right? And seeing the movement happening there. Plus, you just made me think for the first time that like when he throws off his cloak, in some ways, he's showing himself to everybody. Like he can't see, but the people can't see him either.
yes.
You know?
And I
mean,
kind of
Jesus
see him on
does,
the
but-
road covered in this big dark cloak that just kind of is both is protection maybe, but is hiding. It's yeah. I keep thinking about the function of the cloak in this.
Right. No,
Yeah.
that's really good. That's really good. Thank you, Katie. So again, what we're doing with these is just, we're encouraging people to imagine this scene, imagine these three scenes, but imagine it in such a way that later on, when they fold that piece of paper, what we ask them to do is to tell us the story only using their taglines, right? So see how much their taglines can remind them of major facets of the story. So that's the second one. There are other ways to encourage or to learn these stories, and a lot of them come down to the ways that we learn, right? I'm a very visual learner, and so I'm going to stop share for a second and show you that in some way, sometimes what I do is I'll cut up the story, each line, and throw it into an envelope, and they have to put the story together, right?
Yeah.
Line by line, all the way down. That's a way that can help as well. There are also just very simple ways that I call this the Phil Ruggie Jones, a pastor and mentor of mine, who just literally hand writes the text 5 times and then he has it. There's something about that, right, of writing it down. But also, I would say this is kind of a precursor to encountering the story in any way, because in some ways, that's what I did. I typed it, of course. But to get it out of the Bible, I typed it and I, kind of separated it out myself into 3 different scenes. This is kind of the same, this is coming from the same place of actually writing longhand. The script of the scripture can also get that inside us in a different way, right? There's a thing called the Yeshiva school of storytelling, which is encouraging people to move with the text. So at this point, I have people stand up, take their story with them, and I have them say it out loud 3 times, but never stop moving while they do it, as they are able to, of course. And so this is probably my most ableist one. But for the yeshiva school to work, what is kind of amazing is you'll have a room full of people and it just becomes a big cacophony of the story. You'll hear it coming from all corners of the globe, as it were. And it's encouraging people not only to say it out loud and to move around, but what we said before, instead of just sitting here silently in their heads trying to learn the periodic table, we're getting them up and moving them around so that they are remembering all parts of their body with the text. And so in some ways, this is where your nonverbal communications can really help you remember the story. Maybe you heard when I told it that I say, many sternly ordered him to be quiet. With that, like, and that's not necessarily nonverbal, of course, but I'm inserting that into the text because that helps me remember. And I'm also hearing their shushing, which then gets me into kind of a state of mind because I'm making a choice. As Dan mentioned before, when we tell these stories, we're making choices. I made the choice that the people are really pissed off that he's trying to get the attention of Jesus, which is something that we see. And this isn't the only time we see this, right? People grumble when Zacchaeus comes down and Jesus says, I'll have dinner at your house today. They grumble. And so this is something that's happening theologically a lot. But moving the text, getting them up and moving them around is another piece of it.
I enjoy you saying that, because typically when I'm even like memorizing sermons, I know I've got it when I can go through the whole manuscript in my car, right?
Right.
Because I write it, and I'll rehearse like basic blocking in the sanctuary. But other than that, it's my sanctuary, my house when I'm running. And then the big one is if I can hit all those points and hit those transitions while I'm like driving somewhere. But that's that telltale sign. Can I say this in physically different areas?
Right. Thank you. Yes, exactly. We may have all had that experience. I'll just speak for me, where I thought I had my sermon down, ready to go. The manuscript was solid, but I had never said it out loud before. And so the sermon itself wasn't that good because I never read it out loud. And so some things didn't make sense, or some things were a little, I kind of stumbled over some things. And so it really makes a difference, not only to get it out loud, but to get it in different spaces as well. I take the yeshiva school into the shower, right? I'll walk down the street to the grocery store. That's where I really learn my stories. I look like a crazy person on the side of the street just saying things out loud, but it really helps, right? It really
Just put
helps.
in some earphones and everybody will think you're talking to somebody on your phone.
Yeah. There's a part of me that actually likes that. I like them thinking I'm weird or crazy because maybe it's the closest I can feel to one of the biblical prophets.
Yeah.
They think that I'm totally off my rocker. So those are 5 main ones. The 6th one that we're not going to do here, I call communal texting, or the communal remembering of the text, which is after we've heard it many times, and like y'all have already heard it a couple times. We've provoked it a couple times. I told it a couple of times. You've looked at it. And so it'd be kind of amazing at this point to recognize how much of this story you all already know. And so we can kind of tell that together. I would do the main one. I'd say, I would hold the main story within me, but then I'd offer up for people to fill in the blanks. And you'd be surprised how much they can fill in already after just engaging with the story for a little over an hour, right? And the final one, then that was number 6. And of course, I wanted a holy 7. So really this should be, that's the communal retelling, gathering the text. And then the 7th one is just learn yourself, right? What thing works best for you? So I know Phil Rugi Jones will write it down 5 times in a row, and that's what works for him. For me, I know I need to move around a lot. I need to be telling it out loud in the shower and in my car. And so just, how best you can learn. And so do that. That's the idea behind these kind of different ways to, this is different ways to encounter the how. How do you learn a story by heart in this way? Before we move on to our last section, just want to touch base. So is this making sense? I recognizing my audience too. I just want to give you all kind of more of a 30,000 foot view of like how I run a workshop, just because I know I can't teach anybody to learn a story in 2 hours. I could teach them in 3. But to recognize the different tools you can use to engage with the story. You can go even deeper with that tagline, right? So once they write their taglines And then I would even have them turn it over and maybe even map out what Jericho looks like and where is Jesus and where is Zacchaeus. And then I'd have them, fold their paper and then try and tell that story to a neighbor using just their taglines. Those are just different ways to encounter the story. You can also maybe see from my piece of paper that I learned the story a long time ago, and it is well used, right? What's that thing when you see somebody's Bible that's like falling off of the tatters? Every one of us is like, oh yeah, that's a person who knows their Bible. So like these stories should be like falling off at the hinges once you get used, because you should be carrying this with you everywhere, right? Also, just as a side note, the 95% content accuracy for me means that I went back in earlier in Mark's 10th chapter, because we have the exact same thing that happens with James and John, Boanerges, right? They come to Jesus and say to him, we want you to do for us whatever we ask you. And Jesus says the exact same thing he says to Bartimaeus. What do you want me to do for you? Imagine that, like, just as the context, because I wonder if when it gets to Bartimaeus, Jesus asks, well, what do you want me to do for you? Because I just had two of my major disciples ask the stupidest freaking question of me ever and demand me to be at your left and right when you come into your glory. What the hell are you going to ask me to do? And this guy says, just let me see, right? So I think that's also part of the 95% content accuracy, is to recognize what's going on in other parts of this story, right?
I really
have to
love you saying that about the whole 70% accuracy of text, 95% content accuracy, because I remember reading this Miles Davis quote years ago where somebody asked him, like, why do you memorize all this stuff? How do you keep it in your head? And he goes, I memorize it not so I play it note for note, but so I know where it's going. And that gives me the freedom to improvise, which has always been kind of a homiletical thought of mine about, like, whenever you have a manuscript, you don't memorize it to hit it word for word, because that's that 4-letter memorize as a swear word, right?
Right.
But it's to get in that 95% of the content that allows you to kind of imagine, okay, if you're telling blind Bartimaeus from another perspective and the content's there, it gives you that wiggle room.
Yes. And it lets you take ownership of it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So nobody will ever tell this story the way that I tell it, because I've made it my own.
Yeah.
I can imagine, I can see it happening. Richard, you were saying something?
Well, actually, Pastor Hilly just made me think of something. It's sort of like I have friends who occasionally, when we talk every week about the sermons and stuff, and occasionally it's like, oh, let's trade manuscripts. And I'm like, you wouldn't be able to make anything out of what I would send you, these scribbles sort of on a page with a bunch of arrows.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love imagining the Bible that way, because then it kind of gives us a sense of, when we are just looking at the Bible itself and looking at these stories, they are kind of like, they wouldn't make sense to anybody else once we have engaged with it and once we have made the marks ourselves and like trying to imagine what's going on here. But too often we don't do that. We start from scratch with these words. So of course we're going to read them out loud pretty boringly, because we're just trying to read them, right? Yeah. We're not taking it in.
No. This discussion today, I think, has really helped bolster me, and I need to get back to some roots. And I don't often have time, but when I do, sometimes I was taught you take the script or the text and you break it into chunks, and I'll have different words in different colors, and some are bold and some have ellipses in the middle of sentences and things, and just really play with it.
Provoke it, right? Yeah. Play with it. And that makes me think of the sense that these stories, when we take them in, again, it's the most it's the only spiritual discipline I think I do. I really suck at meditating and some other things I think that are like stereotypical things that pastors do. But when I let this text marinate in me, it really affects me.
Yeah.
And to Pastor Hilly's point on the 75% content accuracy, 95% text accuracy, or 75% text accuracy, 95% content accuracy. is to say that what we're trying to do with storytelling is recognize that in the first couple of centuries, there were probably many different storytellers telling stories from, let's say, Mark's gospel. And so I'd hear Dan tell it, and I'd hear Katie tell it in a different way. I'd hear Richard tell it in a different way. And it was interesting to hear these, like what y'all chose to focus on. And it's kind of more living and breathing, right? The minute that we put it in a Bible, it becomes kind of staid. It's not its fault. It's just the way that we treat things that are written down. And so I think there's a little bit of a spiritual discipline for us to recognize that what we have here are fossils, not in a bad way, but it's a fossil that of an actual live performance. And when we tell those stories, we can maybe recover some of that live performance. I mean, it's just like when I read The Taming of the Shrew by William Shakespeare, I had no idea what was going on with any of that. Then I saw it performed and I was like, oh my God. Right. And I feel like that's a lot of what we do when we tell the story when we tell stories from the Bible. I told a piece of Mark's Passion and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, that was amazing. Where did that come from? Right. And I was like, you got one at home. You got a couple at home. It's from the Bible, right? So,
Well, and there's such disagreement in our society among different branches of Christianity about what the Bible is, period.
Absolutely.
That this ends up playing into a lot of that.
It does. It really does. And I come from an evangelical background, and none of them like what I do because they say that I'm interpreting it as I tell it. Mm-hmm. And what I try to get them to recognize is you're interpreting it too. Mm-hmm. We are all interpreting it. Mm-hmm. The question is, how do we engage it in a way that hopefully is memorable? I want to take this last time together and go back to my screen share and just show a little bit to y'all who, kind of in the background, I guess, is to show sort of the importance of these stories and why what we do when we learn them by heart can be so radical. What I've always felt to be a pretty strong part of this is the recognition that stories don't just inform us, they form us. And by that, I mean, when we tell these stories by heart and when we tell them in these bigger chunks, when we recognize these stories not just as little verses that we can use for our own ends, but as stories that have something to tell us, I believe that storytelling really does keep us from what I think is a primary way, unfortunately, that Christians, and to Richard's point, a lot of different Christianity, we have a lot of different Christianities today, but that many of them will use verses or use pieces of the Bible to tell a story that the Bible does not tell. That 95% content accuracy makes sure that we're not telling a story that the Bible doesn't condone. I want to show an example of that with this movie, Sleepless in Seattle. And this idea, these are called recuts or I forget the other term for them, but these very erstwhile editors will take scenes from the movie and pretend and make it a movie that it's not, right? And that's the same thing that we do with the Bible. I just want to show this one clip for probably one of the most well-known romantic comedies that there is.
What do you think happens to someone after they die?
I don't know. He phones in one of those radio call-in shows, tells them, I need a new wife.
What possessed you to give them our address?
They called and asked for it.
There are a lot of desperate women out there looking for love.
Especially over a certain age.
Right? So none of this is lying. They're not lying here. This is all from that movie.
This man is my destiny and I never meet him.
Jonah!
I'm showing you these. I want to show just another quick one. We can turn Dumb and Dumber into an Oscar-winning drama if we wanted to as well. This is the power of these Bible stories, and we have to make sure when we're telling them that we hold true to that larger arc of the Bible. What I would say of good news to the poor, liberation to the oppressed, recovery of sight to the blind, literally. But again, it's tricky because that Bible, those 66 plus books, as we know very well, can be used to create stories that are terrifying that have nothing to do with the Bible itself. But it's tricky because they're still using parts of the Bible, right? And so real quick, the Dumb and Dumber one, just because I find this absolutely amazing. See how the music adds to this as well.
Hello, how are you?
Name's Christmas. Lloyd Christmas.
I'm Mary Swanson.
The most beautiful woman alive flew to Aspen and out of my life.
What the hell are we doing here, Harry? We gotta get out of this town.
Yeah, you just want to go to Aspen and find that girl, and you need me to drive you there, right?
Yeah.
Am I right? Am I right, Lord?
So again, I won't go through the whole thing there, but we have to recognize, I think we get to recognize with these stories that they're so powerful that it's on us to make sure that we're telling them correctly, that there are a lot of choices to make in any of these stories like Bartimaeus, and we can't lose sight of like that larger salvation history, right, of God that comes through in the Bible, that we can easily use these stories to judge and condemn people. And that's something that I should be, or that I try to be aware of as well for my own, in my own ministry. So this storytelling, the 95% content accuracy keeps us from turning these stories into something that they're not. I think it's also really important, like if we tell stories of John the Baptist, that we don't just tell those nice stories of him preaching in the wilderness, right? But also the story here of him being executed by the powers that be in Mark chapter 6. So there's just a lot of layers and levels within the biblical story that if we can recognize the content of it, then we can tell these stories in ways that are memorable and evocative. I think this is probably the most evocative image I've ever seen of John the Baptist, and that axe at the root of the tree. I want to show one more image, or video, I should say. And this is looking forward to the future, that for our 21st century Christianity, I think biblical storytelling is at the heart of it. And once we can learn these stories by heart, I think we can tell them in ways that can add in other mediums, other media, that can go back to the stories that y'all remember first in your life, in your memories. These stories that some can have props, or these stories that are focused on this narrative. And so I want to show I want to show an example of this, of what biblical storytelling can do with the first chapter of John. I call these little videos Bible Unplugged. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to provoke the text using other stories and other images. So there's a fantastic book written by Carl Sagan, rest in peace, called Contact. And it was made into a movie in 1997. And that movie starts off with us following radio waves from the surface of the earth out into outer space. And I wanted to put these two together, this powerful creation narrative from John to maybe be able to sit side by side with the incomparable majesty of our universe, right? So when we start this, just as a heads up, the radio waves start from the earth itself. And so we're going to hear some of the best that the late 90s had for us music wise.
Clearly, I've never been there, but it feels like.
In the beginning was Halagos, the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was with God in the beginning, and everything came into being through the Word. Without the Word, not one thing came into being. What came into being in Halagos was Zoe, life, and the life was the light for everyone. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning the light, so that everyone would believe through him. He himself wasn't the light, but he came to testify to the light, the true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. We've seen this glory, like that of a parent's only child, full of grace and truth. So I submit to you, dear people, that we can tell this old story in new ways. And I think it can really help, and has helped me as a pastor in preaching. As said before, right? A story well told is really a sermon half preached. I think it can be powerful in our teaching as well, that we can provoke these stories for our people and encourage them to provoke as well, and maybe encounter it in a new way. And finally, I think that these can be really powerful in worship settings. I want to leave you with stop share. I want to leave you with just a few weeks ago, I told the gospel at the Institute for Liturgical Studies in Valpo. And that liturgy was so high, which I love, but there wasn't much room for the story, right? Because they did what you would imagine with, or you've probably been in services before, right? Where they brought out the Bible and they processed out with the cross, and it was very anachronistic. As I told the person holding the Bible, I'm not going to use that. Like I'm telling the story. So you standing up there is kind of weird. But they weren't going to move anything around in their worship. So she remained standing there. But I say that to say that even in worship services where it might feel a little like it doesn't belong, I still think it can be a powerful discipline to share with others. It just requires a little bit of us to do things in a new way, which I know Lutherans, that's our strong suit, right? To do something new. But no, I really think that there's a lot of space for this kind of engagement with the Bible that we often fail to do, right? So that is that's my presentation. I'm sticking to it. No, it's really good to be with y'all as we kind of come up on noon. I'm wondering if there's any other last minute thoughts or questions, concerns, thoughts about the meaning of life, anything like that.
Big thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thank you all. I appreciate this kind of more intimate setting. I'm hoping for all of you who watch later on that you find some things that can be inspiring as well. But really, it's just kind of incredible to me that we have an amazing assortment of stories in here that oftentimes we don't touch. And I think that's we're missing something if we don't do that. So storytelling is one way that we can engage with that. And yeah. Very good to be with all of you.
I've been thinking about how this is kind of I've been thinking about the Reformation Project, right? The hopes of the Reformation were to put the text in the hands of the people so that they could read it for themselves.
Right.
And do that same kind of interpretation for themselves. And then the irony is that by putting it in a book, it kind of locked the text into place. And also accompanying this, a kind of a professionalization of the clergy, which had been ongoing already for centuries, also meant that lay people got the message that they couldn't be trusted to do that. And so getting the stories out of the Bible in a way is kind of like the truest fulfillment of the Reformation hope, that these could be stories made real in the lives of ordinary people, that they could come to know them by heart.
Yeah.
And I hope that they, I hope we can tell them that we trust them. We trust them to do that. So thank you so much. That is, it's been just such a great joy to have you with us. It's really exciting to see the new ways that we could be telling the old story. And I've really, really enjoyed this. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you. I think there is something to say about like this transition right now into our digital culture, which I think we're still a part of. We're still in it. But that there is something to say. I think there's something to say about that transition to literate culture that came around the same time as the Reformation, that we are still able to hold on to the oral nature of the Bible, that there's a lot in the 21st century, I think, that's calling us back to the first century and also calling us forward, because I think we are in the midst of a major rummage sale.
Yes.
So what do we hold on to? What's still important, right?
Right. And if nothing else, the pandemic has forced us to assess what are the most important non-disposable things that we want to hang on to. And the stories are at the heart of it.
They're at the heart. They're the central part of it. Exactly.
Yes, absolutely.
Exactly.
Everything else is kind of adiaphora.
Adiaphora. I was waiting for that adiaphora. Totally.
Yeah. So now we are all good Lutherans. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop this recording.